talked about backpacks, which, are sort of required for backpacking. So let's move on to chatting about tents and other shelters. Because you gotta have somewhere to sleep, am I right? Well, that's not entirely true. Cowboy camping, where you just unroll your sleeping bag right on the ground out in the open, is always an option. But that's not for everyone. In fact, I'd say that most campers and backpackers prefer the relative security of a tent or some sort of shelter over just sleeping out in the open. So there are essentially 3 different types of shelters for backpacking. Your typical 3-season tent that's good for use in spring, summer, and fall. A 4-season tent that's more robust for winter camping and high alpine adventures. And a hammock. Bivvies, which are more or less a one-person crawl-in nylon coffin, are an option too, but generally those aren't as popular, so we'll skip them for now. You could also make an argument for more DIY shelters that involve draping a tarp over a ridgeline hung between 2 trees or propped up by trekking poles, but tents are by far the most common and popular shelter among backpackers. So that's what we're gonna start with. What kind of tent you get will depend on where you're backpacking and whether or not you prefer an ultralight style of backpacking. The key is to look for one that suits the temperature and weather that you will be backpacking in and that fits the number of people you will be backpacking with. But before we get into specifics, let's talk generics. Tents usually come in 2 parts, the tent body and the fly. The body is the actual tent that you sleep in. The fly goes over the top of the tent body to protect you from the elements. Now, a fly is absolutely not necessary, strictly speaking, if you are camping in nice weather. When I go backpacking in the summer and there's no rain or snow or dust storms or what have you in the forecast, I very often leave my tent fly at home, sometimes by accident. That offers a few ounces in weight savings in my pack, but sleeping in a tent without a fly also facilitates airflow when it's really warm outside and offers very pleasant views. There are tents that don't have removable flies at all, of course, including some ultralight A-frame tents and most 4-season tents meant for winter camping. These are called single wall tents. Single wall tents are usually very quick and easy to set up, but can sometimes lack conveniences like vestibules or a ton of breathability. It really just depends on the tent. So a fly goes over the tent, but a footprint goes under it. However, unlike a fly, a footprint or ground cloth doesn't usually come with most backpacking tents. You have to buy it separately. That's because it's not always, strictly speaking, necessary. And some backpackers prefer to hike without one. But in our experience, they are a handy item to have. Essentially, a footprint is a durable piece of material that's very likely available in the exact size and shape as your tent, from the same manufacturer as your tent, and goes underneath the floor of your tent. What it does is protect the delicate fabric of your tent floor from coming into contact with the ground, which can scrape, scratch, or puncture the floor, which of course shortens your tent's lifespan. So if you're pitching your tent on gravel, rocks, on top of sticks or grass covered in burrs or any sort of sharp, uneven surfaces, we highly recommend a footprint to help prolong your tent's life. After all, a ground cloth is a lot cheaper to replace than a whole tent, so there's that. Manufacturers of good backpacking tents almost always offer dedicated footprints that you can buy for your specific tent. That's handy because a footprint should be the exact same size, maybe even a little bit smaller than your tent, so it doesn't collect water when it rains, which would then pool underneath your tent. But you can also use something as simple as a tarp from the hardware store. Some ultralight backpackers, myself included, prefer a sheet of Tyvek or similar house wrap product that's been cut to size. But let's talk about ultralight tents a minute. I'm an ultralight backpacker. I've mentioned it before, and that means the less a tent weighs, the better for me. But ultralight tents have their pros and cons, for sure. Many ultralight tents are perfect for warmer temperatures, but aren't the best suited for cold weather. They tend to be made of very thin fabrics and a lot of mesh, which means if you're taking them out in cold temperatures, you're gonna be pretty dang chilly all night long. They're also not as durable, meaning you're probably going to need to baby them a bit more, and you're definitely gonna wanna use a footprint. It's also not a bad idea to keep a few patches on hand in case your tent gets punctured on trail. Ultralight tents also tend to be more expensive. That said, the weight savings can be huge. An average 2-person tent might weigh 4 or 5 pounds, while some ultralight versions hover closer to 1 or 2. That's a really big deal if your goal is to reduce as much weight as possible in your pack. But now that we've talked about a few popular types of tents, let's discuss size. If you're looking to purchase your first backpacking tent, you may be trying to figure out how big it should be. The answer to that depends on you and your style. For example, generally, if there are 2 people backpacking, common sense may dictate that you need a 2-person tent. But that's not always the case. Many backpackers actually recommend getting a tent that has room for 1 more person than you will be backpacking with. That way, you have more space to spread out and store your gear inside the tent. For example, if there are 2 of you, get a 3-person tent. Going solo, a 2-person tent will feel super luxurious. Indeed, it is quite nice to have all that extra space. Every time I've taken a 2-person tent out when I'm on my own, I love it. But it does weigh more, so it's a trade-off. Just ask yourself whether you'd rather carry a little more weight for a little more elbow room, or whether you're fine storing your gear outside in the vestibule area or down by your feet in order to save a few ounces. Honestly, Josh and I have shared a very snug 2-person ultralight tent for years with little to no issue, but we're small people, so there's plenty of room by our feet to stash empty packs and things. If you're tall or broad, you'll likely be much more comfortable in a larger tent. Now, maybe you're not a tent person. There are lots of backpackers out there who swear that hammocks are the way to go. Just a supreme way to spend the night outdoors. I myself love hammock camping. I find it extremely comfortable, especially in warm weather when air can move above and below you, keeping you cooler than if you were in a tent. But if you are hammock camping, there are a few things you'll need. You can get away with just a hammock, of course, but a few additional accessories can help make your experience a lot more comfortable. Accessories like a bug net and a rainfly. The first will help keep the creepy crawlies out and keep you from getting bitten by so many mosquitoes, and the latter can either keep you in shade on hot sunny days or keep the rain off if the skies open up and just pour water in the middle of the night. Some brands, like one of our favorites, Hammock, even sell all of it in one handy package. So if you're new to hammock camping, that might be the way to go. One tip before you plan to go hammock camping though, make sure there will be trees from which to hang said hammock and that you are allowed to hang it in the area you're planning on backpacking. Some parks don't allow hammocks at all, and others won't have trees big enough to support them. But we'll talk more about finding the right campsites for tents and hammocks in a later lesson. Now, when it comes time to pick out a tent, especially if it's your first one, keep in mind that quality is very often directly related to price. So yes, you could save a few bucks by buying a less expensive tent from Amazon or Walmart from a brand you've never heard of, but chances are you're going to have to buy that exact same tent again next season. Cheap tents are cheap tents. They're just not as robust and will very likely tear years before their more expensive counterparts, and that's not sustainable. That said, if this is your first tent, don't feel the need to go crazy and get the most expensive, most ultralight tent on the market. Start with what you can afford, and if it suits your needs, great. If not, you can upgrade to a higher quality model in the future. But we'll talk about what to do with your old gear when you've outgrown it in a later lesson. Another tip, if this is your first tent, practice pitching it in your yard before you take it backpacking. Listen, the last thing you want is to get your tent out into the wilderness and not be able to figure out which poles go where, or how to put the dang thing together, especially if the sun is setting or you're hungry or tired and you don't have cell service and can't look up directions online. So practice pitching it a few times before your first trip to make sure you're comfortable with how it all goes together so you don't get frustrated and, I don't know, start yelling at your campmates in the backcountry. But that's tents, all. We'll list a few of our favorites, complete with links where they can be purchased in the notes below. And as always, if you have any more questions before moving on to the next lesson, drop us a line. An endless debate of tents versus hammocks. Who comes out on top? I don't know. It just depends. I love a good hammock. I really do. But I'm not trashing tents either. I like them both. They have their places. All of the things. Even a bivvy, I guess, from time to time. Though I've never personally used one because, like I said, nylon coffin. I'd rather just sleep under a tarp. Yeah, bugs, whatever, but you'll be fine. Probably. So protect yourself from the elements and wander on.